All right, well, welcome to week 4, the last week on Paul. I hope you've been enjoying this journey that we've been on. We've got some ground to cover, but I also want to make a point to leave a good chunk of time for questions at the end that may have accumulated over the last few weeks, so we can, and maybe even asking you your impressions, some things that maybe were helpful or not about this little study that we've been doing together. So, quick review. Last week, our focus was on Paul's time in Ephesus, right? He was there writing a lot of his letters that we have and writing them back to the communities that he had traveled through on his way to Ephesus. Remember, he's going from the east across Turkey into northern Greece and Macedonia down into Greece and then back again, Ephesus being on the eastern edge of Turkey. So that's where he was, and things were going well. Hold on, George, I want to get started and then we can do questions, okay? Then we get to the point of him being imprisoned for a couple years in Ephesus, for a while in Ephesus, and then he is sort of stuck. And he's writing those last couple letters, Philippians and Philemon. So the first few that he wrote while he seems to have been free, was the 1st and 2nd Corinthians, Galatians, and then he's writing Philippians and Philemon, right? So those Philippians and Philemon are written, it seems, while he is imprisoned. And remember, Philippians, him talking about, trying to get the Philippians not to worry about him necessarily needing to be there for their faith to continue. And in many ways, this is a helpful exercise for him and for the whole early Christian community because the time scale starts to elongate, right? The idea initially was Jesus would be right back. He just ran out, and he was just going to come back in days, weeks, maybe years, but not in generations, let alone centuries. So as the time starts to drag on a little bit, it becomes important for the faith to be able to persist absent the individuals who were the founders of it. Does that make sense? So him being in prison gives him a chance to sort of flex those muscles a little bit. But that wasn't the end of Paul's life, and where we ended last week we talked about Philemon and his interesting sort of not so subtle pressuring of Philemon to release his slave or to free his slave Onesimus, and then Paul himself is released around early 55. We're looking at here around the year 55, and then he sort of tries to get back to work, and he turns his attention particularly to the collection. If you can remember back, I think a few weeks now, there was this part of the work that Paul agreed to do in being the apostle to the Gentiles was to go to the Gentiles, but be sure, remember Peter and James say, to remember the poor, and Paul says, which I was actually very eager to do. And what that really means is that Paul is working through into Europe with these communities, but committed to bringing a financial contribution from those churches back to Jerusalem and to the churches that are around there. So he turns his attention to that and to sorting things out with the Corinthians. Remember, they were the ones with whom he had the most contentious relationship, probably because they were the ones that were the most centralized city that he was working in and had the most other influences and potential problems that became real actual problems. All right, so he's promised to remember the poor. He did not ask in his letters, the Galatians or the Thessalonians, for a collection, but he did push it to the Corinthians. And this was part of their reconciliation to say, okay, if you're really a part of this, this is what it means to be financially a part of this as well. I'll let you draw the connections to the present day. In his letters to them, but in his letters to the Corinthians, he does indicate that he has made progress on this same front with the Galatians. So the letter to the Galatians has no financial appeal, but after the fact, he seems to be referring back to the fact that actually they have started contributing. So there were, as we've said, other letters, other communiques that went back and forth between these different areas, and that, I think, is just one of the sad accidents of history that we don't have all of those as well. So as far as the Corinthians are concerned, Paul's first step in reconciling with them is sending Titus, and he brings a good report back, and Paul is able to then assure them in one of those final letters that's stitched into 2 Corinthians that their giving, he says, is in itself a participation in the glorification of God on behalf of his grace. So that sets up Paul to go to Corinth from Ephesus, which takes a little while, right? He's got to go up and around and down onto the corner of the very edge of the Peloponnesus. And so he makes it into Corinth probably by the end of 55, 56. End of 55, beginning of 56. And this is where he concludes his missionary work in this Aegean Sea sort of area. This is his last stop. And it's also where he writes his last letter, which is the letter to the Romans. Now, the tricky part is that the letter to the Romans comes first in our Bibles. They're not organized chronologically. They're organized simply by length. Romans is the longest, 1 Corinthians is next, 2 Corinthians, and then it goes on from there. And before you leave today, I'm going to give you a list here that may seem very elementary, but I hope it'll be helpful. It's going to list all the New Testament books in order by genre, so that you can sort of refer to that. We've got the Gospels, we've got Acts, which is more like a work of history, and then we've got a whole bunch of letters, and then we've got prophecy at the end with Revelation. And then on the back, I'm going to give you a handout that has, excuse me, the letters that scholars are convinced or sure that Paul wrote, the ones that are disputed, and the letters that are by other people that never claim to be written by Paul. So not every letter in the New Testament is written by Paul. That's perhaps a common, or hope not so common, but it is a misconception. And then obviously Revelation at the end. So you'll grab that. The other handout I'm going to give you before you go, and so please remind me, is another breakdown of a timeline of the best guess times or years of publication for all the books in the New Testament, as well as some of the early letters that come, or early church documents that emerge after the canon of the New Testament has been closed, or that don't make it in. So that those dates will line up close, but not directly with some of the dates I've been giving you. If you remember back to the first week, there's some discrepancy as to how you count some of Paul's years. So there's a little bit of a fudge factor in here, but they're around the same time. So just take note of that. Anyways, his last letter is the letter to the Romans. It is, in many ways, his magnum opus. He's taken all that he's learned in his writings and his communications and his ministry with these many other locations and churches, and he writes, without ever having been to Rome, a letter of recommendation for himself to precede his expected visit there. So the aim is different. It's not managing a community that he had already formed and he wants to sort of remind of a few things or chastise or redirect or, help corral. He's trying to essentially plant a seed from 1,000 miles away that he hopes that when he gets there will have landed among some fertile soil. Okay? It was written while he was in Corinth, and from there, probably because Corinth was this great place to travel from, his attention is drawn further and further west, Rome being the heart of the empire, right? But in some of Paul's writings, he says, my hope is to make it all the way to Spain, sort of the edge of the known world kind of thing. So he has no shortage of ambition as far as his travel is concerned. He is introducing himself in this letter to Christians that may have been there. There may have been the Christian message may have already made it to Rome without him. So there may be some Christians, but particularly to Jews and Gentiles that are there in Rome that he didn't know already. And he is, as a result, the content reflects that aim. Again, this is why it's important to try to understand context, because content reflects context, right? So the context is, he's trying to reach out to people he doesn't know, and he doesn't really know what their roots are, but he's going to try to appeal to Gentiles, to Jews, and maybe even to some early Christians that are there. So that's a broad appeal. So what he ends up doing is emphasizing in a lot of that letter the equal standing of all people who are united not through the law or through the traditions associated with the law, but through mutual care through one another, and through faith. And in that faith, they have access to the divine promise. This isn't a new argument, right? He's been making this argument, but it's always been a reactionary argument to people who are saying, well, remember this conflict between is the promise open or not? in Jesus Christ. This covenantal promise of the Old Testament, do non-Jews have access to it? And so here he's sort of starting with a vision of the gospel that starts in that place, doesn't react to that place. You follow me there? It's a slight difference, but it's important as far as what he's trying to do. And so he's saying the divine promise extends to all nations of the earth, universal and inclusive. From chapter 3, verses 29 to 30, is God the God of Jews only? Is he not the God of Gentiles also? Yes, of Gentiles also, since God is one. And he will justify the circumcised on the ground of faith and the uncircumcised through that same faith. So it's, again, not a new argument, but it's been refined and expanded in the letter to the Romans. So that this essentially becomes his articulation of the gospel. How does he articulate this good news? And he's not trying, it's in some ways we get a window into the messages that he started with that he didn't write down but delivered perhaps in person when he went to Galatia and to Corinth and to Ephesus and these other places where he did found churches, because we're at the front end of it. Now, because he is trying to present an understanding of the faith that includes Gentiles and not just the people of Israel, the discussion of the relationship between the law and faith is inevitable. And that means a lot of Romans is spent trying to argue over law and faith, works of the flesh, works of the Spirit, all those things. So if you're reading through Romans, that's what's behind all that. Again, retreading some of his other arguments, but where he really comes out to, perhaps almost too strongly in this letter, is on the side of faith, not works. To him, this idea is works equal the law. Works is do the things you're told to do, and that will replace any particular belief or feeling or emotional attachment you may have. You just got to do it. And that's the sort of avenue to salvation. So there is an emphasis, some might say an overemphasis, placed on faith. The one who is righteous, he says, lives by faith. And for him, faith comes through Jesus Christ, and so it is only in God's reaching out to us and us responding in faith in Jesus Christ that we are made righteous or have the opportunity for righteousness. But that gift is now given broadly to all people. So it's inclusive, but still a little exclusive at the same time. You follow me? The argument is universal in its reach, but the response is necessary, and the response is one of faith, not works. But his understanding of works was a strict adherence to the Jewish law. Now, part of the reason this becomes a problem is because people in later years reading Paul seize on this emphasis of faith over and above works, such that Paul gets read as someone who's very interested in one's own individual salvation exclusively. I don't know if others have experienced Paul that way or have been taught Paul that way, but Paul gets read as the one who says, if you just believe these things and accept Jesus Christ as your Lord and Savior, you are saved. And my whole argument across these four classes is that Paul was much more concerned with the formation and the construction and the life of the community that is built on this faith than he was with one's individual relationship with God over and above works of justice and mercy and love, etc., etc. Does that make sense? Have people heard a sort of reading of Paul that is very much a sort of solo salvation idea? Can I get a quick show of hands so that the Episcopalians in the room? Okay, good. All right. Excellent. All right, that's helpful because I'm not making that up. It's not a straw man of an argument. That is the reading. But the context, again, is this attempt to broaden out the promise. And the only way in which he can do that is to say, and not have everybody have to go get circumcised and follow the law, is to say it's through faith. And so, as we do, some people latch onto that at the exclusion of all the other work that he does, which is very much a sort of functional, community-based work. We'll talk more about that in a second, but I just wanted to say all that. So one of the ways he talks about this in Romans is that he sort of puts this idea of the first Adam and the second Adam out there. Adam sort of in Genesis, through which sin enters the world and the apple and all that. And then the second Adam in Jesus Christ, being the one who erases sin. Therefore, just as one man's trespass, Adam's, led to a condemnation for all, so one man's act of righteousness, Jesus, leads to justification and life for all. So he's trying to tie it back into almost the pre-Jew, pre-Israel world of the creation. And we all stem from that, and therefore we are all sinners from that, and we are all made righteous by Christ with that same level of generality. Okay? So, but if all have equal access to it, like I said, all are equally responsible to live by that faith. And the idea is not there is the idea, I want to make sure that there is the idea of one's relationship with God being important. It's not there. But ultimately, the goal that I see Paul trying to do is to say, how do you live as a new person born in Christ through your faith in this gospel, in this story that I'm telling you, this good news? And then how is a new people created from that? Because resurrection life, he's very clear, cannot be enjoyed in this present life. The life of the believer is now measured by the adherence of their new conduct to the gospel, the new conduct based on the gospel, which is this law of love, which he promotes, which is reciprocal and relational. But he never quite, this is where he comes to ultimately on the question of whether the promise of salvation extends to law-abiding Jews who reject the gospel of Jesus. He says in chapter 11, it's really a mystery, and I'm not so sure. But he's very clear. He says, Gentiles, don't be so proud. You came to the party late, and you're only here because of God's grace. So don't get full of yourselves. And then he also says, I don't know how it's going to happen, but I do believe that God will fulfill the promise to Israel ultimately as well. Another reason, the reason I'm dwelling on this is because not very often, Paul has in history been read and taken by people with an anti-Semitic understanding of the Christian faith and used. Because they read him as saying they are totally misguided, they are lost in old news, they won't get with the times, and if they reject Jesus, well, then that's their fault at this point. But he doesn't say that here in Romans 11. He says, ultimately, after all these years of work, I believe God will follow through on God's promise, and the people of Israel will be there, and the Gentiles will be there too. So it's not a supersessionist argument. Supersessionism being it sort of replaces or goes on to the Christianity is a more enlightened, fuller version of relationship with God. Judaism has its own value and virtue and rights as well within the context of the covenant. Okay? Again, important because of the way in which Paul has been read over the last 2,000 years. And his final point of his final letter is that the new existence on offer implies giving up all of one's own interests of moral fulfillment or self-glorification in order to promote the welfare of the neighbor and to build up the community. And this is clear throughout the letter, particularly in chapter 12, but he recycles his idea of the many gifts, one spirit, many members, one body. And he says the commandment of love fulfills the entire law. We heard that a few weeks ago when we were reading Romans on Sunday. But it depends on the building up of the community. The fulfillment of law is lived, not strictly intellectual or theoretical. And that takes precedence over every idea of personal perfection. So let me read an extended passage from chapter 12. So we're getting to the end. There's 16 chapters in Romans, 15 that we'll talk about in the 16th chapter, but maybe 1 through 15. So we're at chapter 12, Romans verses 9 through 21. Let love be genuine. Hate what is evil. You've heard this, right? Hold fast to what is good. Love one another with mutual affection. Outdo one another in showing honor. Do not lag in zeal. Be ardent in spirit. Serve the Lord. Rejoice in hope. Be patient in suffering. Persevere in prayer. Contribute to the needs of the saints. Extend hospitality to strangers. Bless those who persecute you. Bless and do not curse them. Rejoice with those who rejoice. Weep with those who weep. Do you hear how this is all relational? This is all community-based. This is his climax. Do not be haughty, but associate with the lowly. Do not claim to be wiser than you are. Do not repay anyone evil for evil, but take thought of what is noble in the sight of all. If it is possible, so far as it depends on you, live peaceably with all. Beloved, never avenge yourselves, but leave room for the wrath of God, for it is written, vengeance is mine, I will repay, says the Lord. No, if your enemies are hungry, feed them. If they are thirsty, give them something to drink, for by doing this you will heap burning coals on their heads. Do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. Okay, that's 12. 13, owe no one anything except to love one another, for the one who loves has fulfilled the law. 15, each of us must please our neighbor for the good purpose of building up the neighbor. Later in 15, welcome one another, therefore, just as Christ has welcomed you for the glory of God. All right, so there's a lot of faith and work stuff in there in Romans, that's true. And faith overworks. But here is where I see the heart of the message of the letter to the Romans. They have not built a community yet. So he's saying, these are your building blocks for that. Take them, use them, and follow them. And this is, again, you can read it again, Romans chapter 12, what that letter is ultimately about. Okay? Now, Romans 16, so that's 1 through 15. Romans 16 is kind of funny. It's tacked on at the end, but it's actually a letter to the church in Ephesus. And the letter is sent there with a copy of the letter to the Romans, like a cover letter. But whoever stitched them together later put it at the end because they didn't really know what to do with it because it didn't quite apply, but it came in the same package, right? So, I don't know, maybe you work in an office where something similar has happened sometime before. But yeah, it's got a long list of names of people who are known to folks in Ephesus but would have no relationship to anybody in Rome. It's settling individual questions in a really beautiful way through the fortifying of Paul's personal relationships. And because this is a letter of recommendation in Romans 16, he also has some recommendation, but you might be interested to know the oldest letter of recommendation for a Christian minister, one who's working on behalf of the church, is for Phoebe, a woman. She was a missionary and congregational president of the church in Cenchreae. And there are a number of women mentioned in this portion, women who had unrestricted involvement and offices of authority in the early church. So worth noting as we think about women's leadership, which has long been contested in the church that has sprouted from these early days. All right, so that's the letter to the Romans. So he ends the letter in chapter 15 by saying he's planning to come to Rome, but he has to stop off in Jerusalem first to deliver the collection. So I know you think I'm just trying to throw that in there, the collection stuff, because it's stewardship season. But actually, it forms a really interesting sort of checkpoints along the way, and actually is very much part of his purpose. And so, before he's in Corinth, it'd be easier to go to Rome from there. But he says, I got to honor my word. And rather than even just sending it, he sort of forms this delegation of people that from different communities as he goes back from Corinth across the land route up Macedonia, around, down Turkey, and back down into Jerusalem. And he brings people along with him from those different communities to deliver the package, if you will, the money that they had collected. So he also feels like he has to go to Jerusalem, not just to sort of make the point that he has fulfilled his word, but apparently there are also some unbelievers in the sense of people not believing that Gentiles should be included in the promise in Judea, causing problems. Again, it's only been a few years. It was 48, 49 when they first settled it, and here we are in 55, 56. So it hasn't quite settled yet. So he thinks, I'm going to bring some of these Gentiles with me that I've converted, and that will sort of bring us together as a church. So he's praying his ministry will be accepted by them. So he says, I'm going to stop in Jerusalem, and then I will come to you in Rome. And this is the last word we have from Paul himself on his ministry. Acts picks up the story here and moves it forward. So he did probably travel from Corinth back to Jerusalem over the land route through Macedonia. That's all recited in Acts, bringing delegates from all the churches who contributed to the collection. When they get there to Jerusalem, Paul and his crew insist on going to the temple, James and Peter those who are in Jerusalem insist on them going to the temple, I had it wrong, before they will accept their collection. Come worship with us in an act and a sign of fellowship. When he's there in the temple, Paul gets accused of bringing a Gentile into the temple by the Jewish authorities. Probably not the Christian brothers and sisters. And this leads to his arrest, which I find is very interesting and ironic. His lifelong goal of including Gentiles in the promise is ultimately the thing that leads to his arrest ends up being in Caesarea. So from 56 to 58, he was all set to drop it off in Jerusalem and get over to Rome. And because he had the Gentiles with him in the temple, he is stuck there for 2 more years. 56 to 58, held in prison in Caesarea. Eventually, I won't go through all of how Acts recites that, but he appeals to the emperor, which was apparently his right as a Roman citizen, to be sent to Rome for trial. So he finds a way to get to Rome as a prisoner, and Acts ends with him preaching under house arrest in Rome. And it's interesting if you think about Luke and Acts, and we haven't talked a lot about that, but I just want to flag this. Luke and Acts ends here, I think. It doesn't go beyond this. It ends with him preaching in the heart of the empire. From the story started in a stable in Bethlehem with a census and from the Roman Empire that drove people out from their homes to where they needed to be counted. And now the story has ended back in the middle heart of the Roman Empire with Paul proclaiming the message of this child that was born in nothing and now has become not just something but everything. So that's the story Luke and Acts want to focus on. They're not actually focused on Paul, even though he plays a big part. So they don't continue from there. We don't know. We have no documentation from that time of what happens after that point. And Paul's death is actually unknown. It's not specifically attested to. What we do have is a letter from called First Clement. Clement was a church leader, but in the 90s AD. So 30 years, 40 years later. It's interesting, we don't know any Christian's name between 60 and 90 AD. Any books or writings that we have there are written pseudonymously, under pseudonyms, or anonymously, and attributed to certain people. So there's a gap in here. And so when it comes back around in the 90s, and Clement writes, he writes this about Paul. He said, Paul showed the way to the prize of endurance. 7 times he was in bonds. He was exiled. He was stoned. He was a herald in both east and west. He gained noble fame for his faith. He taught righteousness to all the world. And when he had reached the limits of the west, he gave testimony before the rulers, and thus passed from the world and was taken up in the holy place, the greatest example of endurance. It's from here that we get that we assume that he was martyred. But it doesn't say that explicitly. There's no time or place. Now, he could have been. I'm not saying he wasn't, but I'm saying he could have been. But we don't have that here. No one said anything, though, about him being killed under the Nero persecutions until the end of the 1st century. So that's, later on. They're trying to figure out what happened to him. It's unclear whether they know exactly, but the idea in the faith is that already within a generation of Paul's work, he's a hero of the faith and a martyr and, the greatest example of endurance. He probably, so there's some other ideas too. He may have made it back to Philippi and had been killed there. He probably didn't make it to Spain, ultimately. The only churches that claim a Pauline foundation historically in the following decades and then centuries are in Asia Minor or Turkey and Macedonia and Greece, that area that we've been talking about him working in. Doesn't seem like he made it all the way to Spain to found churches there. They don't have that history there. Now, that's what we know. Again, it's murky in this section of time here. But the first collection of Paul's letters is also probably made during this time. Like I said, he was famous in his day. Not like a lot of people in olden times who only become appreciated after the fact. Right? He was known throughout the ancient world. And so his letters are valuable to them. And the first collection of his letters was most likely made in the East, not in Rome, as some people believe, but probably in Ephesus, which was the location of his ministry for so long. But this collection of letters was known by people in Rome and Antioch, all the way from the heart of the empire all the way to the eastern edge. All right, so that's the possibility. There is indications they're referring to letters of Paul that are collected and being distributed. And those churches there possessed copies, even if he had not written to them specifically. So we can start to see this transition from letters into Scripture. You see what's happening here? They're collecting them, passing them on, and it's no longer directly applicable to one's circumstance immediately, but is meant to be general good information for one to have as a believer. Around 90 is when we start getting people's names again. The book of Revelation, written by someone named John, and there's some evidence for that. But we also start getting church leaders from those early churches that have been founded: Clement, Ignatius, Polycarp, Dionysius. And Dionysius is one who refers to some letters that are in circulation. So that's how this starts to form. There's not yet a New Testament. There's not yet a canon or a sort of agreed upon list of books that are in there, but there is starting to be, it seems, some sort of collection of Pauline letters. Okay? So that's how Paul it gets a little whiffy at the end there about exactly what happens. But it's that transition does happen. Exactly how, it's a little bit unclear and hard to say. Now, I'm going to take 2 minutes to talk quickly through the fact that you guys might be wondering why I keep saying we're done with Paul when there are more letters in the New Testament that claim to be written by Paul, which is an important point. Like I said, it was clear in his lifetime that Paul was he was a titan, a big figure. So more than a few people thought to claim his name for their letters that probably weren't written by him. And I will, if you will take this now, actually is a good time to hand it out. And Rob, would you help me here? Just take one and show me, I think, that one here. Like I said, I've got the list of all the New Testament books here so you can keep track of those. But on the back here, we've got Romans, Corinthians, Galatians, Philippians, Thessalonians, Philemon. And then we've got ones where Paul's authorship is disputed. That means there are scholarly arguments about whether he actually wrote them. And there are some that are very clear he did not write. So the differences, the way they can tell that is from differences can be found in the theological ideas, the vocabulary or the style of writing, and the events that are inconsistent with the verifiable Pauline letters. So most likely not by Paul is the letter to the Ephesians. And that is because there are these long sentences, elaborate sentences, and they're at variance from the Pauline language of how he's talking about things. Okay? But it is still a beautiful letter with soaring passages about the church as the body of Christ and exhortations to unity and holy behavior. So it is not without value in its own right. Also, the pastoral epistles, which they're said to be letters from Paul to Timothy and to Titus. The organization, but they're talking about the organization and function of the church in a way that is very clearly developed later, from a later development. And they're theologically variant from some of Paul's work. The vocabulary and the style is different as well. You know, he says things like presbyters, which is starting to sound like, priests or elders. They didn't have that in the letters that he was creating. Now, maybe by Paul, it's a little more of a split decision on this. Colossians, somewhat more disputed authorship. It's thematically related, what to believe, what to do. The language and the style, though, and some of the theology are different. And still, there is some glorious stuff in there. And if it's not Paul, it was probably a close follower of his writing in his name to the letter to the church in Colossae. And then there's 2 Thessalonians, also disputed authorship. The scholars are split. It's very different from 1 Thessalonians, and also has some controversial theological claims about the second coming, which, again, Paul and his followers thought was imminent in their lifetime. But the claims about how to live don't seem to jive with the other letters. It seems not to fit. Now, some people may take this hard when I give this information, but this sort of idea of historical critical analysis is not meant to disabuse people of their understandings of the faith, because I don't think it's worth us saying that Paul has to have written it for us to find value in it. I think it's worth asking ourselves how we assign importance or relevance to these books if they do not attach directly to the people who they say they were written by, which in those days, in that day and age, there was no copyright. This was a common practice to write in the name of a well-known figure, because that sort of gained you access and eyeballs, if you will. People were paying attention if they either thought Paul wrote it or they knew that it was a follower of Paul, but history has claimed it for Paul alone, or something like that. So I don't want this to say, oh, these books are somehow not valid. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is there is value in them, just as there is with all the books of Scripture. But we should know that it was probably not written by this one particular person, written by someone else, like all of Scripture, who was inspired in the faith and a part of the early church communities who were trying to live by this law of love. So even if they're not by Paul, they can still teach us something, edify us, and nurture our life of faith. And the same question will come up in the Gospels, right? None of whom claim to be, the Gospel of Luke we're going to talk about. The Gospel writing, the book that we have, says nothing about it being written by Luke. That has been attributed, right? Does that make it somehow not valuable? I don't think so. We may feel a little burned because that's what we've been taught, but that's not the book's fault. That's the church's fault for how it's taken it up from there. So, my conclusion here, Paul was an essential figure, but also very complicated. What he accomplished was incredible, and I hope you can see that in what we've talked about, and we owe him a debt of gratitude, and he gave us some of the most in-depth theological writing, since he's wrestling sort of in real time with what it means to believe in Jesus. And he gives us some of the most beautiful, soaring, inspiring passages of the New Testament. But he also has some troubling stuff in there. Stuff that has caused many problems in the years since he wrote it. And I talked about anti-Semitism, women in the church, homosexuality, another one of them as well. And he particularly gets problematic when he comes up with his prescriptions for how Christians should live. When he gets overly specific, his context informs his views, as we should understand does for all of us. And yet, does that mean it applies to all of us throughout all time? But if I can leave you with one thing, it's that for him, the primary goal of his work as Paul the evangelist, the apostle, is the establishment and maintenance of the community, the ecclesia, the gathering of the faithful. And this is the foundation of the life of the church. The key component that he nurtured and facilitated, because it was sort of like a laboratory to practice living out this new gospel. Taking care of one another, sharing in the faith, sharing a meal, all those things. And this unit is the foundation of the church. What becomes the church, which even by the time he died, was nothing like a church or even a religion. It was an offshoot of an already marginalized faith group. It's not a building. It's not even a set of doctrinal or systematic beliefs. That was not Paul. Paul didn't come up with the Nicene Creed. But it's people coming together, practicing loving service toward one another, sharing a ritual meal to connect them and to live as people who were trying to love one another and their neighbors and their enemies. Now, obviously, it's taken on more, and this idea of the church has taken on different forms over time, but we cannot lose that as our foundation. And that's why I wanted to start with Paul this year, as we're talking specifically about this idea of community formation and why it is so essential. Not just because it's nice to hang out together and eat together, but actually it's fundamental to our identity as Christians and as a church, as the church. So whether we like him or not, and I'm going to leave that open, I at least think we all owe him a debt of gratitude and a chance to just say simply, Paul, thank you. So thank you. That's where I will wrap up these 4 weeks here. But let me open it for a few more questions before I let you know what's coming up. George, you had a question earlier on, and then I'm going to come to Carrie and Rod here. You sure? Okay. All right. Thank you. Carrie?
When you talk about the first Adam's trespass, is that where the original sin comes from?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yep.
Second, how did you get out of the Ephesus prison?
He was released. It's unclear exactly how, but he was released. There's a story in Acts about it, a sort of miraculous finding his way out, sort of the angel breaking it open. Whether that happened or not, he somehow got out. Yeah.
We were talking about the order in the Bible, the letters within order, how long they are. How are the Gospels ordered?
They are ordered. We'll talk about that. I'm saying Mark is the shortest. That's second. Matthew, Luke, John is later. The synoptics are ordered in the order that people thought they were written, but it's clear that Mark was first, and Matthew knew Mark, and Luke knew Mark, and other sources as well. And John seems to have known some of them, but he was on a different track.
So it's kind of, okay.
Yeah.
And last one, do you think Paul was a good writer?
I think he was. I think he didn't have the benefit of an editor, because once you wrote it on the parchment, you weren't going to scratch it out, right? I mean, it was there. So all of you, the red line copies, I think he probably, but that's why he's not like systematic, right? He's not like going back to his other letters and saying, well, I said this before, so maybe I should say it this way as well. Yeah. Ron.
There's a belief among a significant number of evangelicals that a prerequisite to the second coming is the restoration of the Jewish people to their ancestral homeland in Israel. Is that consistent with Paul's writings?
So the question, because I forgot to repeat Carrie's question for the people who will watch this later, is this idea of a Christian Zionism, if I can use that phrase, which is a prerequisite for the second coming of Christ, and some people's reading of Scripture come from Paul. I don't see that in Paul. I see that in some other places and other understandings of what is required for the second coming. Paul's idea of the second coming was, again, shorter term. So this idea of restoring all the people to Israel, I mean, he didn't, the revolution that happened in 70 AD, he didn't probably live to see. And that was where the destruction of the temple happened and where the Jewish people were really, the diaspora really started. So the idea of the restoration, I think, is later. It's not a lot later. It's within some early Christian views, but it's almost too favorable. Unfortunately, there was for a while there, a strong resentment between early Christians and the Jewish people. And you can see that in like John and things like that. So I don't think they were pinning their salvation on the restoration of those people. And
one other question.
Yeah, sure.
One of the themes that I've caught on here is you don't have to be circumcised to be a Christian.
That's fair. We will repeat that for home.
But
Yeah.
are there mainstream Christian faiths in the United States that think that's a prerequisite to a christening, or that it's somehow still something that good Christians should do?
The question is around whether circumcision is something that some Christians view as something that should be done. I've actually encountered the opposite, if I've encountered it at all, which is if you are deeply of a strain of Christianity that believes strongly about this, that having your male son circumcised is some ways a bad thing. Because that is living by the law, even if you may have a medical reason or whatever reason you want to have for it. So I've heard the opposite because of that very reason. To say, Paul said, don't do it, so we're not going to do it. Whereas we could say, he said you could do it, you don't have to do it. And he's saying it's up to you, but don't think that's the thing that gives you access to God.
Right.
Yeah, good. I got Nancy and Andrew.
Oh, I have two.
All right, good.
The list that says others.
Yeah.
I must have missed what you said.
Those are the other letters, not written by Paul.
Not written by Paul.
Yeah, but written by others.
They know that those aren't. Okay.
Yes, they know, and they never claim to be, and they have their own histories that we won't get into
Correct.
today.
Okay.
Yeah.
I just want to make sure. And how did he get out of the prison in Rome?
That we don't know. Acts leaves us with him still under house arrest. It's unclear whether he did get out of that prison in Rome. So we don't know. Now the tradition is there's a story of his martyrdom in Rome under Nero. It's hard to verify that historically.
Is that who he asked for the trial? Nero?
No, he appealed to the emperor. It was, I forget exactly who was it in Acts, but Claudius, yeah. But around that time. And if you read the stories of Nero, you'll know that he had other reasons to blame the Christians for various things that were going on in the empire.
So that's still...
That's questionable and probably unlikely. Yeah. Andrew, question.
Well, mostly, correct me if I'm wrong, but doesn't Messianic Judaism practice circumcision and kosher diet?
Yes, there are a lot of Judaism still very much practices circumcision, kosher, a lot of the laws of the Old Testament. Yes.
I mean, like Christian.
Oh, Messianic Judaism, you're saying within Christianity. That falls both outside my expertise and in a gray zone that I wouldn't feel comfortable speaking to exactly what their beliefs are. But there are some people who claim Judaism with a messianic understanding of Jesus Christ, and that's, again, outside my purview. But thank you for bringing that up. There's lots of tributaries that have come off the main rivers of Judaism, Christianity being one of them. And Christianity itself has many, many, many tributaries as well. Other questions, final questions before we leave? Thank Steve, and then Jamie, you want to say something? Okay, Steve, go ahead quickly, yeah.
So I forgot his name, but I read about a heretic who was going around teaching that what Paul was really teaching was that the God that he was teaching about was so different than the God of the Old Testament that's focused on the minutiae of the law.
Yeah.
They were actually different gods.
Yeah. That's an interesting idea. I mean, you can read Paul and decide for yourself. I don't think he ever says that the God is somehow different. I think he's saying the access to that God has been rewritten. The God has not changed. Our relationship or our opportunity for relationship with that God has changed.
Yeah, I think that's had to do with going from being the God of the nation of Israel to this God of everyone with salvation.
And that, I think, yes, you could see how that would say, well, it must be a different God. And the idea being, again, for the people at home, some people have claimed that Paul is preaching a different God, a different monotheistic God than the God of the Old Testament. And that idea, I think, is a false reading of Paul. And I think it's also a false understanding of God. I think the expansiveness of this was challenging to that original conception of who had access to that God and how they had access to God. But it was not based on, I don't think Paul anywhere is saying anything along the lines that this God is somehow different and negating the earlier relationship, even though he's trying to expand from it, not erase it. And that's an important distinction historically.